Washington, D.C. What would you do when power and privilege demand your silence? Washington, D.C. The city buzzed with the hum of power, a place where influence often dictated outcomes. Judge Elijah Morrison knew this better than most. He had spent decades upholding the law with integrity and fairness, refusing to bow to pressure from politicians, corporations, or the elite. His courtroom was sacred, a place where justice was supposed to prevail. As one of the few black judges in the city, Elijah had seen racial injustice firsthand. He had witnessed how the law bent for some and crushed others, but he had never backed down, not once. He had earned his reputation as a man who delivered real justice, regardless of who sat before him. Today, however, he faced a courtroom unlike any other. The accused was none other than Abigail Thornton, the daughter of billionaire real estate mogul Richard Thornton, a name that could open doors or close them permanently. The case? A hit and run where an innocent man had lost his life. The victim, a construction worker named Luis Rivera, had been crossing the street when Abigail's luxury car sped through a red light, striking him with deadly force. She had fled the scene without a second glance. Security footage, eyewitnesses, and forensic evidence left little room for doubt. She was guilty, but Richard Thornton believed money could fix everything. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, activists, and high-profile attorneys filled every seat. Outside, protesters demanded justice, their voices echoing through the courthouse halls. Signs reading, "Justice for Luis" and "No special treatment for the rich," waved in the air. Elijah sat at the bench, his expression unreadable. He knew the pressure would come. Political favors, veiled threats, discreet conversations about his future. Already, whispers had reached his chambers. Thornton had powerful friends. Friends who could make things difficult if Elijah didn't rule in his favor. He gripped the gavel tighter. Abigail sat beside her high-priced legal team, her face impassive, her designer suit immaculate. She looked bored, as if the proceedings were an inconvenience rather than a fight for accountability. Her father sat behind her, his jaw tight, his gaze locked onto Elijah. The prosecution presented its case, methodical and precise. The security footage played for the jury, the grainy video showing the moment of impact. Gasps rippled through the room as Luis Rivera's body crumpled onto the pavement. His wife, seated in the front row, wiped away silent tears. The defense predictably painted a different picture. Abigail had been scared, disoriented. She had panicked. Wasn't she just a young woman who had made a terrible mistake? Didn't she deserve a second chance? They argued that her charity work and privileged upbringing should count for something. Elijah's jaw tightened. Privilege. That word had shielded too many from consequences. But not in his courtroom. As the trial progressed, Elijah could feel the weight of every decision pressing down on him. One ruling in her favor, and his life would be easier. But at what cost? He glanced at Luis Rivera's family, at the grieving wife, at the daughter who would grow up without a father. And then he looked at Abigail, unbothered, untouched, waiting for the system to do what it always did for people like her. What happens when justice meets entitlement? Would you stand your ground when power and privilege demand your silence? Washington, D.C. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the wet pavement, sirens wailing through the night. On the cold asphalt, a man lay motionless, his life stolen in an instant. But the driver who had hit him? She was already gone. Madison Kingsley, 24, had been drinking at an exclusive lounge just blocks away. Witnesses later reported seeing her stumble to her car, laughing with friends, as she slid behind the wheel of her sleek, black luxury sedan. Then, minutes later, she sped through a red light and struck Luis Rivera, a construction worker heading home after his late shift. Instead of stopping, instead of calling for help, she hit the gas and disappeared into the night, leaving him for dead. By the time authorities identified the driver, the Kingsley family's legal team was already working to make the case disappear. Luis Rivera's widow pleaded for justice, but weeks passed with no arrest. The Kingsleys pulled strings, stalled the process, and used every trick in the book to delay charges. It took months of public outrage, protests, and media pressure before the case finally reached the courtroom. But when Madison finally arrived at trial, she showed no remorse. She sat beside her lawyers, her designer suit tailored to perfection, her expression unreadable. If she felt guilt, she hid it well. Meanwhile, her father, billionaire William Kingsley, smirked from the front row, exuding quiet confidence. He had seen this before. He had fixed problems like this before. Money could make anything go away. The courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and members of the public who had been waiting for justice. Luis Rivera's family sat in the front row, their grief etched into their faces. His wife clutched a photograph of him, her hands trembling, her eyes filled with silent fury. Judge Elijah Morrison scanned the room, his face unreadable. He had handled high-profile cases before, but this one was different. He could already feel the weight of what was coming. There would be pressure, whispers of what a verdict against Madison could mean for his career, calls from powerful figures reminding him how things usually worked. But Elijah Morrison wasn't like other judges. He had seen too many families shattered by privilege, too many victims denied justice because the defendant had the right last name. And today, he had no intention of being part of that system. The prosecution laid out the case with precision. The security footage from the intersection played on the courtroom screen, showing the moment of impact. The jury flinched as they watched Luis Rivera's body slam onto the pavement. His wife turned away, unable to look. The defense, as expected, attempted to rewrite the story. Madison had been disoriented. She had panicked. She was young, from a good family, and had never been in trouble before. Should her entire life be ruined over one mistake? Judge Morrison kept his expression neutral, but his grip on the gavel tightened. Privilege. That word had given people like Madison a way out too many times before. He looked at her, calm, collected, waiting for the system to bend in her favor. He looked at her father, relaxed, self-assured, knowing he had spent decades making problems disappear. Then, finally, he looked at Luis Rivera's family, at the empty space in their lives that no amount of money could ever fill. Judge Morrison had seen injustice before, but this case, this was different. Would you have the courage to stand up to power? The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Spectators whispered among themselves, journalists prepared their headlines, and the Rivera family sat in silent grief, waiting for justice to speak. At the center of it all, Judge Elijah Morrison sat at his bench, his face unreadable. He had presided over hundreds of cases, but this one felt different. The air was thick with tension, and beneath it all, the scent of privilege loomed like an unspoken threat. Then the doors opened, and Madison Kingsley strutted inside. She wore a striking red dress, as if she were attending a gala instead of facing trial for a hit-and-run. She moved with an air of entitlement, flashing a practiced smile at the cameras before taking her seat beside her lawyers. Not once did she acknowledge Luis Rivera's family, nor did she glance at the prosecution's table. To her, this was just another inconvenience, another mess for her father's money to clean up. As the prosecution laid out the case, showing footage of the crash, presenting witness statements, and detailing the forensic evidence, Madison barely paid attention. She filed her nails, whispered to her attorneys, and checked her reflection in a compact mirror. If she had any remorse, it was buried beneath layers of arrogance. The room bristled at her indifference. Even the jury shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another as if struggling to comprehend how someone could be so detached from the gravity of the situation. Then she stood. Without being called, without permission, Madison Kingsley rose from her seat and, with slow, deliberate steps, walked toward the judge's bench. Gasps rippled through the room. Her attorney hissed her name under his breath, but she ignored him. She stopped in front of Judge Morrison and leaned in, lowering her voice just enough for only him to hear. "Your Honor, let's be reasonable," she said, her lips curling into a smirk. "My daddy can buy anything. Tell me your price." Silence. A deep, unshakable silence fell over the courtroom. Judge Morrison's expression remained unchanged, but his grip on the gavel tightened. He slowly turned his head, his sharp gaze locking onto her. "Say that again. To my face." The weight of his words sank into the room like a stone. Madison's smirk faltered, if only for a second. Whispers erupted among the spectators. Reporters scribbled furiously, some even reaching for their phones. The jury sat frozen, their eyes wide. The Rivera family, who had spent months fearing that justice would be bought, watched with a glimmer of hope. Madison hesitated. She had spent her life getting her way. People bent to her father's will, rules adjusted themselves to fit her comfort. She hadn't expected resistance. She straightened, her smile now strained. "I was just saying—" "You were offering a bribe," Judge Morrison interrupted, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. In open court, in front of the jury, in front of the victim's family, Madison's attorney shot to his feet. "Your Honor!" Judge Morrison raised a hand, silencing him. "Sit down." Madison exhaled sharply, glancing at her father. He was no longer smirking. His face was tight, his eyes burning with anger. Not at his daughter, but at the fact that, for the first time, money wasn't enough. The judge turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have just witnessed, in real time, what this case is truly about." The courtroom fell silent. Madison Kingsley had no idea what she had just done. Judge Elijah Morrison slowly rose from his seat, his towering presence casting a shadow over the courtroom. The room fell silent, every eye locked on him. His expression was unreadable, but his grip on the gavel was firm. Power and privilege had tested him before, but never so brazenly. "Miss Kingsley," he said, his voice measured but sharp, "justice is not for sale." Madison's smirk barely faltered. She tucked a strand of perfectly styled hair behind her ear, as if he had simply misunderstood her intentions. "I was just suggesting that we find a practical solution," she said smoothly. Before she could continue, her father, William Kingsley, stood abruptly from his seat in the front row. "Your Honor," he said, adjusting his suit jacket, "we'd like to discuss a settlement." A ripple of whispers spread through the crowd. The Rivera family tensed. The jury exchanged wary glances. Even Madison's lawyers looked uneasy. This was not how trials were conducted. Not openly, not in full view of the press, the public, and the grieving family who had come for justice. Judge Morrison's sharp gaze met William Kingsley's. "You think this courtroom is an auction house?" Kingsley smiled, but it was strained. I think we can be reasonable. Madison is young. Surely we can work something out that benefits everyone." A tense pause filled the air. Morrison exhaled slowly. He had seen this play out before. Cases where money dictated the outcome, where privilege rewrote the narrative. He had presided over trials where wealth smoothed over the rough edges of responsibility. But not today, not in his courtroom. He turned back to Madison. "You are on trial for taking a man's life," he said, his voice now firm enough to shake the room. "You will show respect. You will show remorse. Or you will face the full weight of the law." For the first time, Madison looked uncertain. Her father, normally in control, looked just as shaken. The cameras clicked. Reporters scribbled furiously. The jury sat at attention, absorbing every moment. Naomi Bennett, the prosecutor, seized the opportunity. She rose from her seat. "Your Honor, the state requests that this blatant attempt at bribery be added to the court record." Madison's lawyer shot up. "Objection. That was not a bribe." Morrison held up a hand. "Overruled. The court will take this into consideration." The weight of his words settled over the room like a stone. For the first time, money had failed the Kingsley family. Madison's lips pressed together. She turned, looking to her father for reassurance. He offered none. Judge Morrison sat back down, his gaze sweeping the room. "We will proceed with this trial, but let this be clear. Justice cannot be bought. Not here, not today." The balance of power had shifted, and now the real trial began. The tension in the courtroom was thick. Every breath held as the prosecution prepared to do what no one else had ever done: force Madison Kingsley to face the consequences of her actions. Naomi Bennett, the state prosecutor, adjusted her glasses and stepped forward, her voice calm but sharp. "Ms. Kingsley, let's start with something simple. After you hit Luis Rivera with your vehicle, did you stop?" Madison shifted in her seat, crossing her arms. I was scared," she muttered. Naomi nodded slowly, then took another step forward. "Scared? Or just unwilling to face consequences?" Madison's lawyer shot up. "Objection! Badgering the witness." Judge Morrison's gavel struck the bench. "Overruled. Answer the question, Ms. Kingsley." Madison swallowed, her carefully crafted demeanor beginning to crack. I didn't think it was a big deal," she said under her breath, barely audible. Gasps erupted from the crowd. The Rivera family tensed, disbelief and outrage flashing in their eyes. The reporters, pens frozen over their notepads, stared in shock. Judge Morrison's voice cut through the noise. "Not a big deal? A man is dead, Miss Kingsley." Madison's lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently in her ear, but she looked shaken, her hands trembling slightly. She had grown up in a world where mistakes were swept away with checks and apologies issued through attorneys. But here now, she was face to face with something money couldn't fix. Naomi didn't let up. "Miss Kingsley, let's clarify. Did you even check to see if Mr. Rivera was alive?" I didn't know what to do." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "You didn't know what to do? Or you just didn't care?" Tears welled in Madison's eyes. "That's not fair." "What's not fair, Miss Kingsley?" Naomi pressed. "That a man lost his life? That his daughter will grow up without a father? That his wife will never see him walk through their door again?" Naomi took a step closer, her voice rising. "Or is what's unfair that you're finally being held accountable?" Madison wiped at her tears, struggling to maintain her composure. Her father sat rigid in the front row, his face red, his jaw clenched. This was not how things were supposed to go. Naomi turned toward the jury, letting the silence hang for a moment. Ladies and gentlemen, what you're witnessing today is not just a trial, it's an unraveling of entitlement. She faced Madison again. Do you feel remorse, Miss Kingsley? Madison hesitated, glancing at her father, then at her lawyer, before finally whispering, "Yes." "Say it louder." "Yes," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Naomi let the word linger. Only now, when the world is watching. Judge Morrison leaned forward, his expression stern. "Miss Kingsley, this court does not deal in convenience. We deal in truth. And today, the truth is unavoidable." The room sat in stunned silence. For the first time, Madison Kingsley had no response. And that was when something unexpected happened. The air inside the courtroom was thick with tension. Every breath was held, every movement frozen. All eyes were fixed on the jury box, where 12 individuals held Madison Kingsley's fate in their hands. After hours of deliberation, the jury had finally returned. The courtroom braced for the decision that would either confirm or shatter their faith in justice. Judge Elijah Morrison adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. Has the jury reached a verdict? The jury foreperson, a composed woman in her 40s, stood. "We have, Your Honor." A ripple of murmurs swept through the room. The Rivera family clutched one another's hands, their grief mingling with anticipation. William Kingsley sat stone-faced, arms crossed, his jaw clenched so tightly that the veins in his temple were visible. Madison, however, remained eerily still, her hands folded in her lap. The judge nodded. "Please read the verdict." The foreperson took a breath. "On the charge of vehicular manslaughter, we find the defendant, Madison Kingsley, guilty." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Luis Rivera's widow covered her mouth, silent tears streaming down her face. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, cameras flashing as the words echoed through the courtroom. Madison's jaw dropped. Her fingers curled into the fabric of her expensive dress as reality slammed into her. Her father's face darkened with fury, his grip tightening on the edge of his chair. This wasn't supposed to happen. William Kingsley shot to his feet. "Your Honor, we demand an appeal." His voice was sharp, full of unchecked rage, as though the mere idea of his daughter facing consequences was an insult. Judge Morrison met his gaze with an unwavering stare. "Mr. Kingsley, you are out of order. Sit down." Kingsley didn't move at first, his nostrils flaring. His influence had always been enough to bend the system in his favor. But today, in this courtroom, it was useless. Slowly, begrudgingly, he lowered himself back into his seat. Madison turned to her lawyer, her breaths coming faster. "Fix this," she whispered, panic creeping into her voice. "I can't go to prison." Her attorney exhaled sharply. "We'll file an appeal, but there's nothing we can do right now." Judge Morrison's voice rang through the stunned silence. "Justice is not up for negotiation." The weight of those words settled over the room. The jury members, now free from their duty, exchanged glances, some relieved, some shaken. They had just defied the unspoken rule that the rich and powerful were untouchable. Naomi Bennett, the prosecutor, glanced at the Rivera family. They would never get Luis back, but today they had received something the system so often denied people like them: accountability. As bailiffs approached Madison to take her into custody, she shot a final look at her father, her eyes pleading. But for the first time in her life, William Kingsley had no answer. The courtroom doors opened, and outside, the chants of protesters grew louder, their voices carrying the message that today justice had been served. But what happened next stunned everyone. Madison Kingsley's red dress was now wrinkled, her face pale as the cold steel of handcuffs clicked around her wrists. The weight of reality finally settled on her shoulders. There were no more deals to be made, no favors to be called in. The Kingsleys had always dictated the rules, but today the system had spoken for itself. As she was escorted from the courtroom, the press exploded outside. Reporters rushed to the courthouse steps, cameras flashing, microphones jostling for position. Chants of protesters filled the air, some cheering, some demanding further reform. The case had captured national attention, and everyone wanted to hear from the man who had refused to bow to power. Judge Elijah Morrison stepped out of the courthouse, his face stoic but composed. The press swarmed, throwing questions at him from every direction. "Judge Morrison, were you worried about pressure from the Kingsley family?" one reporter called out. He adjusted his robe, meeting their gazes without hesitation. "No one is above the law," he said firmly, "not even the rich." The statement sent a wave of murmurs through the crowd. In a city where influence so often outweighed justice, these words carried more weight than any verdict. The Kingsleys had expected another cover-up, another slap on the wrist. Instead, they had been met with something they were unaccustomed to: accountability. That night, after the chaos had settled, Judge Morrison returned home. He sat in his modest study, a book open in his hands, though he wasn't reading. His mind replayed the trial, the verdict, the moment Madison Kingsley realized that wealth could not shield her from the truth. It was not the first time he had ruled in the face of power, and it would not be the last. But this case had been different. It had sent a message. The justice system wasn't perfect. He knew that better than anyone. But today it had worked. Today, the victim's family had received something many before them had been denied: justice that wasn't decided by a bank account balance. Elsewhere, Naomi Bennett, the prosecutor, sat with the Rivera family. Luis Rivera's wife held a framed picture of her husband, silent tears falling onto the glass. "Thank you," she whispered, voice thick with emotion, "for not letting them erase him." Naomi smiled gently. No one could ever erase him. Meanwhile, William Kingsley sat in the back seat of his car, staring blankly out the window as his driver pulled away from the courthouse. He had spent his entire life ensuring that consequences never touched his family. Now, for the first time, he had no control. No amount of wealth could undo the verdict, as no lawyer could rewrite the truth. And as the city skyline blurred past, he realized something that had never crossed his mind before. He had lost. The Kingsleys would appeal, of course. They would fight, pull strings, do everything in their power to lessen Madison's sentence. But the world had already seen what happened. The public had witnessed a judge who refused to be bought, a jury who refused to be swayed, and a system, if only for a moment, that worked the way it was meant to. Judge Morrison had delivered a verdict that day, but in the end, he sent a message that no one would forget. Would you have done what Judge Morrison did? Share this story if you believe in standing up for justice.